Let's try to make this a fairly reasonable thing. I think we can do that. So I think we're up. Good, yes. So welcome to Worldbuilding Wednesday. Starting very late today. I unfortunately got involved in some coding fun, which turned out quite well, but I completely lost track of time. So apologies for that. But today we will be talking about human rights when it comes to building a fantasy world. So let's go ahead and in our document, go ahead and add, a section on this. I actually have a thing here. A section on this. We will slide this up here because I didn't want to cover this too quickly. And we'll go ahead and start our bulleted list. So this is obviously a touchy topic. And I want to start by saying that the important thing to think about here is more human rights than the latter more than the former. What do people think basic human rights are, and to whom do they apply? And it's important to note that can vary a lot from group to group, in the sense that there can be sort of basic human rights, but also kind of general human rights. In other words, you can say, okay, those people are technically human, but they don't have the same rights as as we do, as regular humans do. This actually gets back to a thing from the classic sci-fi novel Dune, and this is something that I think was very influential on a lot of authors, is the idea that that there's a difference between people and humans. That humans are the best part of a race, or more accurately, humans are the self-sacrificing part of the race. And then there are a lot of people. In other words, there are a lot of people running around there who act less like animals. Is the way of thinking of some characters in the book, and so they kind of differentiate between just regular people and humans, where humans are capable of self-denial and self-sacrifice and all sorts of other things. So that's kind of one place to start, is this question of, okay, we have this concept of basic human rights, that kind of everyone should have this, but you may have a society in which there are various levels of rights for different people at different times. And it should also be noted that a lot of our language around this has evolved a lot over time, which affects how we talk about this and how we think about it as a result. The Declaration of Independence talks about certain inalienable rights, but those words were applied to a certain segment of population. The founding fathers didn't actually mean that literally every human being necessarily had those rights on them all the time. Also, it should be pointed out, some societies believe that certain rights can be taken away. We believe this. We believe in freedom. We believe in the basic right of people to move around and have the freedom of movement, unless you're guilty of a crime, in which case we restrict your freedom. And so certain kind of basic rights are removed from people who are criminals in our society, and in almost all societies. So that's the thing to think about, is what are rights in your world? So let's start documenting some of this stuff. Rights. There may be multiple kinds of humans, superhumans, subhumans, etc., who have different rights. Rights can be taken away, e.g., criminals do not have the basic freedom of movement. So that's an important thing, is to kind of define those levels of rights for different people, and in what cases can those be restricted. You think of a fantasy scenario with kind of traditional magic spells, and if you have a society, especially with like D&D style magic spells, that can do like mind control, that is fundamentally taking away a human right to sort of mental independence, right? And that may be something that is restricted. That you cannot actually do that. So yeah, that's magic can definitely affect and can change people in a way that interferes with their rights in society. It should also be pointed out that historically, very few people had very few rights, meaning that the definition of what a human being had a right to has evolved over time, and in very ancient periods, people, especially people lower on the totem pole, had very few rights. And even folks higher up in the totem pole didn't necessarily have all the rights we have now. A priest could select a noble's daughter for sacrifice, and too bad. That's just the way the cookie crumbles. So rights definitely evolve and change over time, and the concept of what is a basic right. So that's a weird thing too. And again, as you go back into earlier societies, and it should be noted, a subnote, when you're struggling for survival, rights are not on the front of your mind. So in societies that are hard scrabble, and earlier societies aren't necessarily hard scrabble, but when you're dealing with your basic needs of survival, of food and water, and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you don't tend to spend a lot of time arguing for the right of independence for political stuff, right? There's only so much you can kind of worry about at any given time. So yeah, also should be pointed out, much of society's rules are about basic rights, giving or taking away. I should say, punishing. So basically, many crimes can be phrased as interfering with others' rights. Interference of rights and taking away of rights as punishment. So stealing from somebody can be seen as as interfering with somebody's right of possession. Right? You have the right to control and own the things that you possess, and theft interferes with that. And then often the punishments of a society are some form of right removal or right restriction. So you cannot move out of this jail cell, or you lose control over some of your property. You have a fine to punish you for that crime. So those are all sort of factors into all of that. Then of course there are so it's worth noting when it comes to indentured servitude is voluntary loss of rights. Let me spell that correctly. Loss of rights for a specified time. Typically with some reward at the end. So, for example, if you wanted to travel to the New World, you might become an indentured servant to somebody who is going there and promise them your labor for the first 5 years you're there. And then when they're end, they would give you some small stipend, and you'd be freed from that indentured servitude. So you have to work for them for those 5 years. It doesn't make you a slave in that sense, in the sense that they can do anything. They can't just kill you if they don't like you. but you cannot, you cannot just run away and decide to work for somebody else legally. So indentured servitude is saying, I am going to essentially give my labor for some length of time in return for this particular thing I want. And it might be, again, a ticket over to somewhere else. Hey, Jacob. This is for whatever culture you're building. So these are things to think about when you're building a world or a society or a culture. How does that culture see human rights? Racial favoritism in female slaves. I don't understand the question there, Schizo. If you could elaborate, I would be happy to dig in, because race and gender are two very different things. Slavery is involuntary loss of rights, but not necessarily all of them. And the reason I lay this out is because a lot of the sort of pop culture stuff around slavery tends to present it in a very black and white way. But actually, a lot of societies had a lot of laws around what you could or couldn't do to a slave. Whether you could, what was appropriate punishment, that kind of stuff. So, our view of slavery is a very all or nothing one. And when you're telling a story in which these things exist, it is important to treat that respectfully, and to treat it as something like what we would see historically, where this is a part of culture, and so culture will have had to deal with these things. So it's important to kind of think through, okay, how would a society react to these sorts of situations and these sorts of things happening around treatment of somebody, right? So it's important. Would you use female slaves population increase in your country or empire kingdom? Well, I'm not writing it, right? That is a good example, though, of something where in most societies, if you own somebody, you cannot necessarily have sex with them willy-nilly, so to speak. Again, technically, it's not like somebody is standing over you watching you all the time. That is something that would be frowned on or would be illegal. And if that happened, they could seek damages or seek reparation or something. The other issue too is that if you do that, that becomes a big problem, and this gets back into questions of not just ownership, but of like inheritance and things along those lines. One of the reasons people generally didn't do that is that a child could then potentially claim inheritance from the parent, even as a slave. You're still, if that person dies without an heir, like you are now the heir, and you are now potentially the next person in line. So it's a dangerous game to play. So yeah, not a thing you want to do easily, because there are cases of that in history. The other important thing to recognize is there's a good case, I forget the name of it. There was a man in Greece, I think, who was one of the wealthiest men in Greece at the time. He lived in the house of like a senator or something, and he was that senator's slave. But he had accrued a huge amount of material and possessions, because that was legal. Slaves could own things, and he had accrued a huge fortune and all sorts of other stuff, because in Greek law at the time, and again, this is half remembered, but this is an example. Slavery simply meant I paid money for you, and you do work for me as a result of that. But it didn't imply any other restrictions and rights necessarily, right? You could still own property, you could still own land, you could still own all sorts of stuff. You could kind of come and go. You just, obviously you had to stay in that under the auspices of your owner, but you could still be very successful and very popular, and this person was very well known. So there's a lot of that stuff going. Well, Schizo, that is not really a topic I want to cover right now because this is not really about modern human society. This is about world creation. That's something you can certainly think through about what human trafficking does and the effects of human trafficking. But you kind of have to figure out your rules of how your society thinks about these things, and then you can think through those consequences, right? Why would you want to conquer an area and enslave people, right? To bring those in, and all the implications. But again, if and that's again one of the things that very much differentiates culture. So another good example is in Jewish law. Every 7 years, you had to free all of the slaves. So anyone who'd been enslaved within the past 7 years was freed in that year. So it was a society that had slavery, but ultimately that would not last a hugely long time. And yes, that meant that if they were enslaved the year before, then they got freed. So it's kind of an interesting sort of aspect of society. So kind of how you have to kind of deal with that stuff is think through kind of how that society views these institutions. It's also pointed out, and one of the reasons you see this so often in other and earlier cultures is once you get beyond hunter-gatherer stage, once you get beyond hunter-gatherer, but before industrialism, there's a lot of unpleasant work to be done. Mining for metals is work that is really hard to do at scale, and find people willing to do it. Farming at scale is really hard to do. Basic farming, and by that I mean sort of communal farming, so like Amish scale farming, is actually not huge amounts of work. It is quite reasonable for people to do. It's a lot of work, but still. Whereas again, once you're trying to feed an empire, there's just so much work to do. There's so much stuff to do, and just the tools and equipment and processes are not advanced enough to feed a lot of people with a small amount of land and such. And that tends to encourage these practices, right? Where native citizens do not want to do this work, so it makes sense to find other people and then force them to do that work. So you tend to see that a lot in a lot of these civilizations, is that who else is going to get the work done, right? Not saying it's right, but that is the force behind a lot of these things. And it's why a lot of these cultures tend to be very war-focused, because that's one of the things that war provides, is a captured populace you can then bring back and put on your own farms and do that. So that's an important thing. Also, slaves and servants live with you. And this is a fact that people tend to forget. And it's a really important one. In fact, I might move it up. Well, no. So the important thing here to remember is that, again, if you own, and I find these words uncomfortable to use. I just hate the practice, but it was a thing. So if you owned a slave who worked in your house, you encounter them every day. They were part of your household, right? You couldn't just forget they existed. And if they were sad, you saw them sad. If they were happy, you saw them happy. Now, obviously, that relationship creates a certain kind of control and also of very unpleasant requirements around it. But it does tend to create a relationship of some kind, right? So if you have a society where slavery is not just people working out there, but they're actually living there with you in a household, in an environment, you're gonna have a different viewpoint on that. Um, if you have slaves raising your children, right, they're gonna have a very different view on that institution than other people. It doesn't necessarily mean that people raised in that way think that all slaves should be freed, for example, but they will have these people living with them day by day, hour by hour. Um, it's one of the reasons why slavery in the American South was a very distinctive institution, because you did have folks living in houses, but a lot of it was plantation based, where they're all out there, right? And so there's a strong distinction between like field workers and house workers, and it's very distinctive. It's a really good point, Jacob. Actually, I'm actually gonna write that down. Polytheistic religions are more tend more towards viewing. How to put this? Viewings might be more inclined to see people as belonging to different categories / classes / castes, and thus be more comfortable with slavery, right? It all depends on your society and how they view those things, but you're right, that can create things. It also depends a lot on the mythology. If your creation myths are all about conquest, then it's a lot easier for you to imagine that, for you to imagine slavery as an acceptable thing, than if your myths are more about individuals and more about sort of a more agrarian view of life. So it all depends a lot. So yeah, and that's an interesting thing. As society expands, it often has to confront this aspect, and as society changes, it often has to construct this. I often use Japan as my example in a lot of these, because I know a lot about Japanese. Well, I know more about Japanese culture than most other cultures than my own. And one of the remarkable things about Japan is that at some point around, I forget what point, it's certainly common era, slavery disappeared. Over the course of about 100 years, just people stopped owning slaves. Like, slavery was a thing, and it was consistently recorded, and then people just stopped doing it. And there's no specific, that I know of, recorded documentation of why. It's like people just decided not to do it anymore. And there could be any number of reasons for that. There could be some religious firebrand. There could be some economic changes, some changes to the social structure, or just kind of a general sort of social shift saying, this isn't really effective anymore. Or this just isn't, we're just not comfortable with this anymore. This isn't working for some reason. So that can happen. It wasn't Christianity, I don't think. Not that I'm aware of. I think this was before Christianity came over. But in exactly schizo, like you have different cultures like Athens, Sparta, for example, or Athens and Sparta, which had these kind of viewpoints on this. But if that history had taken a different turn, they may have needed a large population of workers to maintain a large civilization, a large empire. And that would have potentially very much caused a lot more of that. It just really depends. And you also get just people who are more or less comfortable with it. We've had abolitionists throughout all of history, and we've had people who are all for it, frankly, because they think that is just kind of part of how the world works. So if you have a succession of emperors who are kind of against it, then it can fall out of favor in a society. And and again, depending on how the economics of that society is built up, if you kind of need all these people, so to speak, to farm the land, and you can't just free them all and then have everyone starve, it becomes a lot harder to deal with it, but it can shift and change a lot. Yeah, I don't know, Jacob. I'd be curious to dig out, but again, it's very much an open question as to why slavery in Japan just kind of vanished. And there was not a lot of it. I mean, slavery, as far as I know, was never a massively widespread institution. It was more from what little I've read, it was more like punishment for crime or things along those lines. So generally, criminals were enslaved. So yeah, it wasn't an institution. It wasn't like you had tons of these around in every city. So I don't know. I guess it was an institution, but it wasn't a wide, it wasn't a widespread cultural thing that was integrated into everyday society. I'll put it that way. So that again, one of the reasons why I think it was easier for that to fall out of favor. All right. So as usual, I like to apply this to to our two settings in some way. We're not going to get into too much detail about this. You can spend hours going through all these elements and thinking through all of the implications. But setting one is our Bronze Age setting, post-apocalyptic, but so far past the apocalypse that people now live in these traveling caravans in a highly verdant, overgrown world. So we can imagine a somewhat simplified, somewhat lightened version of post-apocalypse, where that apocalypse caused all the vegetation to grow very, very strong, and everything's just full of life and just going crazy. And so as a result, there are some dangerous parts of the world where the vegetation is just really taking over. But in general, people have regressed to a more pastoral life. They have caravans going from basically orchard to orchard and area to area, gathering food and living and such, and kind of from farm to farm. And then in various pockets are these ruined cities. So the remains of New York and Vancouver and all these cities are going to still be there, but covered over with vines and vegetation and such. So in that society, which is a pretty agrarian society in the sense that they kind of think in terms of plants and in terms of regeneration, renewal, those sorts of things. Human rights. That's going to imply a much more pragmatic view on human rights. If you think of everything as just kind of dying and then coming back, you generally aren't as worried about preserving human life, for example, as you used to, or as other cultures do. Joseph Campbell talks about a culture where, every few years an adolescent is chosen as a sacrifice. And the thing about it is that if you live in a society in which every metaphor is vegetal, everything is about seeds and coming back, and you have a belief in reincarnation, the idea of being chosen as a sacrifice is not a big deal because you're going to get reborn as soon as this happens, right? You may not remember what you were, but it's like, okay, so this life ends, but another life is going to begin in a little while, and it's sad to lose this life. We'll have another life soon out of many regenerated lives. So that idea like human sacrifice suddenly becomes just less horrible to the people involved, right? You can understand why they would be willing to go through with it. So Jacob, to be clear, when I say post-apocalypse, I didn't say Earth post-apocalypse, right? Post-apocalypse in some society. When I say New York or Vancouver, I meant New York or Vancouver equivalents. Do I know much about Shintoism? I know some, enough to speak about Shintoism, but I couldn't, name a dozen gods off the tip of my tongue. So I'm going to say, and we already mentioned in this that human sacrifice it's not common anymore, but it was a feature of their religion and has fallen out of favor, but is still happens here and there in more remote communities. So we're going to say there are, let's define it. The death of a human implies regeneration, so is not seen as, is not, so self-sacrifice, and I don't know if this is a human rights thing. It will impact it, but it's not really directly related. So we will say, let's just dig into it. Indentured servitude is quite common for short periods, a few weeks to a few months, basically bartering work for some item, right? So you may say, all right, I will operate the bellows in the forge for you for the next 3 weeks, and in return, at some point during that period, you will forge for me these horseshoes, whatever that would be. Also, by the way, Bronze Age is a general is a term. I don't mean that Bronze Age does not necessarily mean a specific. It is referring to a specific metal, but it's referring to a particular period in civilization development. Anyway, so I think that would be a fairly common thing. Long-term indentured servitude is also, we'll say, not unheard of. So slavery. Again, I can imagine the society being one that is fairly comfortable with slavery, but if you have a society of small caravans moving from place to place, so you have these small groups where a single caravan is going to be maybe 100 people, even if you are enslaved, because you are living very closely with these people, you're going to have generally more rights. So it's going to be less like our classic sense of what slavery would be like. And it also becomes less clear why you would do that. Small communities hold together very closely, and so you really don't want somebody who's an outsider, somebody for whom the rules don't apply in that. Yes, you can push them around. Yes, you can kind of make them do whatever. But it also creates this very complicated situation where if things go south, suddenly that person is a risk, is a threat. And this is, I call it a verdant utopia, in the sense that the general traveled areas are going to be less dangerous, right? So you're very unlikely to be attacked or hurt during the regular rounds of a caravan, which makes this a little bit easier, but it's very complicated. See here. Well, Jacob, the idea in this society is nobody's mining anything because you don't need to. Nobody's fighting any wars. Nobody's building any new things. Everything's scavenged from the old materials. And there's plenty of like wood and such things. So, that's all fine. There's plenty of metals around. You just, again, go to a city and pick one up. Pick something up. And folks aren't thinking in terms of, I need this kind of technology, right? It's just not that level of society. And there are relatively few humans, which helps. So I think, so we'll say, slavery exists as a short-term punishment for crimes. I like that. That if you do something really bad, and again, maybe murder would be an example. You can be, enslaved to work somewhere doing something for, say, a few years as punishment. Maybe not for maybe for death in this society, because again, that's kind of regenerative. So we'll say things like second-degree murder murder is often punished with multiple years of slavery. Slaves still have some basic human rights. They cannot be, wantonly killed, assaulted, etc. They can be physically punished, but within reasonable bounds. Right? So, yeah, that typical stuff. But under the same rules, you would physically punish a free person, right? So any kind of punishment you might apply to anyone could be applied to a slave. So that makes sense. Humans have the basic right to freedom of movement. Very important. Slaves have limited, slaves and indentured servants cannot, obviously cannot leave their owners, but are never fettered or otherwise physically. So here's a neat thing. Physical restraints are abhorrent. So in other words, like shackling somebody is considered really, really horrible. Like that's really disgusting to restrict someone's physical, like, just movement. You can tell somebody, okay, you have to, work for this person for the next 3 years. But they're not going to be, chained to it. They're not going to be fettered to it. And obviously, if they break away from that, then they get, their further punishments go along, up to and including, say, the death penalty. Who's granting them these rights? So it's not so much granting them these rights as what society is enforcing. So life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Also, humans have the basic right to food, particularly forage. No person can prevent another from gathering wild food, because this is a society that does that all the time. And that's kind of how they get a lot of their food. I imagine this is a very important thing where even if you're in some strange situation, even if something is being locked down, even if you're being punished for something, for example, you can't, you always have the right to go out into the woods and get something to eat if you need to, as long as it's not running away. So I like that. Let's stop there for setting 1 and move over to setting 2. This is our more industrialized setting. So it is a civilization in which gunpowder is starting to become a major part of society. So there's a good amount of metal around, a lot of mining. It's a heavily island-based world. So there's one big central island that is volcanic and that has a lot of mining on it. So most of the metals are being done there, and that's kind of the capital, if you will. And then there are hundreds of islands around there that all have their own civilizations or their own variations on their own civilizations on there. So each island's a little different, but each one is not wildly different, right? It's not, the French living next to the Chinese, living next to the Japanese, living next to Polynesians. But there are variations from island to island. People live on ranches generally, so a lot of meat. A lot of animals. Families live very close in these giant houses. So imagine there's kind of one big ranch house that everyone is living on or living in, and so families tend to live in these, essentially apartments in that house. And then as you grow up, you eventually get your own room. Magic is very different. Rare, powerful, erratic, and requires a familiar. So you cannot just cast magic. You need a familiar to cast it through, if you will. And the more you channel magic through a familiar, the darker it becomes. That darkness kind of just naturally purges out of them over time. That means that you can't just push a familiar further and further and further. Or eventually, it will go dark, at which point it becomes kind of wild and crazy, and will generally leave you. So there's that. Actually, I want. I said there might be 1,000 islands. I don't know. Although that just sounds so much like salad dressing. So what do you do? So yeah, it's basically big dude ranches. People generally live on those. A lot of leather clothing. Justice is meted out by a sheriff on each ranch. Minor crimes punished by fines and or change in social service. Major crimes, banishment or death. So no real slavery. And that makes sense. Again, if you have this society where people are living in these little ranches, again, kind of a small society, or small groups of people, slavery becomes a little harder to sustain in that kind of way. So, but there may be situations. So you have sailors. I don't know. So let's see here. Human rights. I'm having a difficult time, to be honest, imagining how human rights would be very different in. Thank you. The magic system is actually inspired by Digimon. So, this is also a society where I can imagine indentured servitude being fairly common, but we've already done that, so I don't want to repeat myself here. So we're going to say that. Ooh, how about this? It is considered a very serious life vow to pledge yourself in indentured servitude to another. You might do this once in your life. Stories are told about it. So this is a very formal thing that you can do where you say, I pledge to work for you to do this, to sort of, work off this debt or whatever. Maybe it's kind of like, I forget the character in the Bible who, worked for 7 years for his wife. It would be kind of like that, where you enter in this very specific contract for this very specific thing, but you don't do it regularly, and it's not a thing that people just go into. And also, it is very personal. It is very personal. Never imposed from without. A few societies practice slavery, but it is considered abominable by other societies who are putting immense pressure. A few islands. This widespread and highly abusive slavery. Pressure on them to stop it. So we're going to go the other direction and say that slavery exists. It's nasty. It's rare in a very small part of the world, and people really hate it and are really trying to stop it. So we have this natural thing going on there. Natural source of conflict, natural source of issues. So let me just scroll back up to our justice and get a sense. Fines, change in social services, criminally receive worse food, don't even know various services, highly complicated hierarchies of various punishment by banishment. So, right to food is ranches often restrict access to food as punishment. This may not. This is rarely literally starving a person, but punish. But that you get the idea, right? So you may get restricted rations as a result of something, right? So you get rice and beans for the next week because you spat in somebody's drink or whatever. Ooh, speaking of magic, I want to talk about that for a minute. People have the right to marry whoever they want. I want to figure out human rights around marriage. At what point can somebody, at what point can a man and a woman who love each other very much, at what point can they marry with or without approval from parents or otherwise society? Marry whoever they want. And this is assuming a society where marriage is a more procreative thing. So men can live together, women can live together, all that kind of stuff. But marriage is generally a contract to have children. Let's see here. So what do we have there? I think in this society, you're gonna have people who, one second, Alexa, stop. Apologies for doing anything there. Well, of course, Jacob, that's because this is about building your own culture. And your culture can be as monolithic as you want. Isn't that nice? I can have a completely monolithic culture if I want. You don't have to, but I do. And also, of course, I'm speaking generally, right? I'm speaking of, all of these will vary from island to island and specific culture to specific culture. If I said every culture is different, then I can just shut off the video right here because every culture is different. But the purpose of this is to provide example settings with some kind of cultural norms. So, once they come of age, there is a period of a few years in which parental approval is required. Teen years, we'll say, right? So, and we haven't defined exactly when all this happens, and I want to kind of leave that fairly vague. So maybe when you're 15-ish, you decide to leave home on your walkabout in search for a mate. And so you kind of go from ranch to ranch and see who else is on walkabout or who else is kind of still there, not on walkabout, and see who you might want to settle down with. And if they're still living at home, then there's if they were within a certain age, a few years, teenage years, mid to late teens, then maybe their parents require approval. But after a few years after that, then there you go. Well, no, Jacob, what's happening here is I am describing various views on human rights. I'm not describing a guarantor because I'm not describing every single aspect of how a culture enforces human rights. You're absolutely right that cultures need various ways of enforcing these, but I'm not saying that you have to define all of those when you are defining your setting's views on human rights. Right? You can't. The whole point of this is that when you're inventing a setting, you need to think about various aspects of it. But you can't think of everything all at once. You have to start somewhere. So I'm starting by thinking through a society's views on human rights, and then you can think through how those are enforced. Right? In fact, let's go back and say, how are these enforced? Right? So it's a very, it's a valid thought, but it doesn't mean you can't think through or think about a society's views on human rights. So Crazy Mitch, those are very modern concepts. Right to healthcare, right to guaranteed minimum income. Those basically are things that have been invented in the past few decades. I don't know of any society prior to, the year 2000 that believed that people had a right to housing, a right to healthcare, a right to a guaranteed minimum income. So I don't have enough context to be able to speak to those as views on rights. We just don't have enough examples of them culturally to see what a society with those ideas would work. Not late Middle Ages, but anything. So one of these is more like Bronze Age-esque, and one is more like Industrial Revolution-esque. It can be anything, but these are. So I'm trying to choose things that are reasonably well represented across a reasonably wide spectrum of societies, of human societies. So we have something to talk about, right? So we have something to kind of compare it to. But yeah, so those are some places to start. Like I said, there are certainly a lot of other places you can go. Let me just go back to our principles. Basic rights, indentured servitude, slavery, rights being taken away. So importantly here, I haven't defined a lot of basic human rights because again, those will vary from society to society, and we can kind of we could kind of go through and say what those rights could be and say this society has and this society doesn't. But for now, I kind of focus this more on slavery, indentured servitude, things along those lines, just to give us an example. So that is where we are with that aspect of world building. I'm going to stop it there because that's a fairly reasonable place to again, get some ideas going on that. So thank you guys for joining me, and I'll be back next week with some more workshop making stuff, actually. And I got a bunch more videos about this up on the YouTube channel and on geekarchaeology.com. Hope you see that. And I hope this has been useful. And until next time, I hope your worlds are very entertaining.